As what's happening in the rest of New South Wales, joining me now is the Labor leader, Chris Minns. Thanks for your time. Lockdown scheduled to end on Friday. It appears in doubt. What's your view on what should happen from what we know so far?
Well, we hope that the lockdown does finish on Friday and that Sydney-siders and the regions that have been affected can return to normal. Obviously, people have sacrificed a lot over the last 10 days, and if we abide by the health orders, I'm very hopeful that it will lift on Friday and we can get back to some sort of normality as we head into the weekend.
The Premier's resisted a lot of lockdown calls before. What do you make of her course of action throughout this pandemic on lockdown calls, including this time?
Look, they're judgment calls, and while ever the government is listening to the expert advice of Kerry Chant, the Chief Health Officer, we'll support it. We'll offer bipartisan support. Obviously, no one wants these lockdowns. It's not what anyone in Sydney wanted, but I think it was the appropriate course of action given the severity of the Delta strain and how easy it is to transmit, particularly in a crowded city like Sydney. So the right call in the circumstances, and we're very hopeful it lifts on Friday and we can get back to some sort of normality.
The plan was outlined from the Prime Minister on Friday to, a lot of people hope, end lockdowns in the not too distant future, albeit we are talking next year. What did you make of the 4-point plan?
Well, look, I mean, at least it's a blueprint to get back to some kind of normality in Australia. I think that's what everybody's hoping for, at least some light at the end of the tunnel, considering the heartache and the difficult period everyone's gone through over the last 18 months. I mean, most countries, OECD countries, are heading towards some sort of timetable. I noticed Singapore on the weekend outlined theirs. It's good that the government's doing theirs. We simply don't know what vaccine percentage will necessitate moving from stage 1 to stage 2. And I think all eyes will be on that in the coming weeks so that we can get some dates around when restrictions will be lifted and we can travel overseas and have people come into our country.
That number's decided upon by experts, but they have to hear what the risk appetite is from the politicians. That's how this has to work. So what should that be? Do you agree it should be treated along the lines of the flu? I know they're not the same thing, but the flu, we do accept hundreds of deaths a year. In the macro, obviously each individual death is a tragedy, but in the macro we accept it and we accept people will get seriously ill. Is that what we need to start talking about for COVID?
Well, look, we need a common sense approach to it, but it does need to be guided by epidemiologists. That's not a degree or a profession that I have, and we do need to listen to the experts. One, there's not many advantages of being one of the last countries to roll out a vaccine program, but the one small advantage is that we can learn from other jurisdictions, work out what's gone well, what hasn't, and then work out an appetite for Australia and in particular New South Wales about what will work. So one of the advantages that we will have is that we can watch the rest of the world and work out what they've done first.
Well, I understand you're not an epidemiologist, but the states are all having to agree to what this number is based on what it will result in. What is the risk? What are we willing to accept? What's your view on that?
Oh, Tom, look, how long's a piece of string? This will have to be done in a common sense way. I can't nominate a mortality rate or a fatality rate from COVID into the future. As I said, it needs to be driven by medical advice. It must be done in concert with professionals. And I do think that we can learn from other jurisdictions to find out what's worked around the rest of the world, particularly Europe and the United States.
Right. But COVID's become essentially a zero fatality thing in Australia. In one sense, that's great. In another, it's going to hold us back in the future. Do you agree we need to get away from that?
I do think that we need to drive up the COVID vaccination rate as high as possible. The 30% hesitancy or reluctance amongst the population's probably too high when you listen to the expert testimony of epidemiologists and health experts. So that's a cause for concern. Whether the number's 70 or 80%, I don't know. I know Singapore will have 2/3 of their population fully vaccinated by August, and they are looking to return to some kind of normality at that point. With Australia at about 6 or 7%, we're a long way behind. So it's going to take some time to roll out that vaccine and work out what we're dealing with before people are fully vaccinated.
You've been pushing for public sector workers to be able to get leave to take the vaccine, sick leave essentially. Is that for every public sector worker? And how would this differ from sick leave they already have? Why do they need something specific?
Because let's look at teachers, for example. Nearly 50% of the teachers in New South Wales in public schools are under the age of 40. So up until recently, they weren't able to be vaccinated to protect against the spread of the disease in public education and to stop it being transmitted from kids to teachers. Now, that's a big worry and a big concern in New South Wales. So once the levels of supply are lifted, we believe it's the New South Wales government's obligation as the biggest employer in the state to drive innovative ways of lifting the vaccination rate. That's the shortest distance between where we are at the moment and where we need to be, which is some kind of normality in New South Wales and in particular Sydney, where the majority of people live.
These teachers and so on you talk about would still have access to multiple levels of annual leave. Isn't the bigger problem anyone who's a casual, regardless of what they do, if we want to really drive vaccination rates up, they need some sort of backing financially to get a vaccine?
Well, certainly we are focused on everybody in New South Wales getting vaccinated, but the New South Wales government, as the biggest employer in the state, can be a model employer when it comes to this, show some good faith amongst their own workforce. And secondly, obviously, the nature and profile of public servants are that they are frontline workers. So whether they're paramedics, whether they're police officers, corrections officers, or particularly of interest in the next couple of weeks, public sector school teachers, we think it's a good way of driving up the vaccination rate in New South Wales and reducing the spread and risk of the disease.
Just finally, look, we'll get into this state issue of speeding fines. We had warning signs taken away in New South Wales. Now drivers can be fined going both ways. Will this maybe just make people drive particularly safely? You want this scrapped, do you?
No, we want to return to high visibility policing. The signs returned when it comes to speed cameras. We used to fine about 1,500 people a month. We're up around 27,000, and the number of speed cameras is about to triple. So this is straight out of the pockets of working families in New South Wales. I'd prefer they didn't commit the offence in the first place. So let's get the speeding signs back and our highway patrol on the beat. That's the best way of reducing, I believe, the fatality rate on New South Wales roads.
So as Labor leader, if you become Premier one day, what's your pledge on revenue out of this? Because it can be a tempting one.
Well, look, the focus needs to be on returning to high visibility policing and putting the signs back, because more often than not, the speed cameras are located at black spots. So I'd prefer the offence didn't occur in the first place. And that's the best way, I think, of driving down the road toll, not with the focus on revenue raising from the New South Wales government. And Tom, that's risen by 1,500% in just the last 5 months.
Chris Minns, appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.